Today's video is sponsored by Ground News, of whom more in a bit. Good evening. It's a fine day to take the tram. Well, actually, when I recorded this voiceover, it was a fairly gloomy day in November, so really it's a matter of opinion. Today, I'd like to take a look at Morden Road. Morden Road is the fourth tram stop from Wimbledon, and sits between Merton Park and Phipps Bridge. But before it was a tram stop, it was a station. And before that... well, let's start at the beginning. That makes a certain kind of sense, I think. Our story begins more than 200 years ago, before the steam train was even invented, in fact. In 1803, the Surrey Iron Railway opened. This was a horse-drawn tramway between Croydon and Wandsworth, linking the many mills along the River Wandle with the River Thames, which in the days when railways and decent roads were a rarity was a major highway for cargo. Initially the railway was a success. It was one of Britain's first public railways. But it couldn't compete with the canals, and it was too lightly engineered for steam locomotives, so it ended up closing down in 1846. That's the end of the Surrey Iron Railway, but it's just the beginning of our story. A group of business folk in the 1850s saw potential in the abandoned line and proposed a railway known as the Wimbledon and Croydon Railway. This would connect two major towns together, Wimbledon and Croydon if you haven't figured that out, both of which had lines into London. It would partially incorporate the Surrey Iron Railway. The line was authorised in 1853 and opened in 1855. It seems to have been built in rather a hurry because the Board of Trade required 3 inspections to be satisfied that it was safe. Even then, on the first day, part of the track had to be rebuilt due to the fact that the trains rocked rather alarmingly. For much of its route, it was single-tracked and served fairly unpopulated areas. Mitcham was the only town actually on the route, other than the ones at either end. The station at Morden Road opened a little later than the line in 1857. It had a single siding, a single platform, and no goods yard, which indicates that it was fairly bare minimum. Despite this, the actual station buildings were quite substantial. If you'd like to see what they looked like, you could do worse than look at the surviving station building at Merton Park. The station was named Morden, which was not exactly accurate. Morden itself is about half a mile from the station. But the town centre has shifted. Morden Village, which was the town centre in the 1850s, was more like a mile and a half away. So calling it Morden was incredibly brazen. Still, the railway company weren't going to miss out on potential passengers for the sake of a little geographical nitpicking. And in any case, it wasn't as if there was any alternative for Morden residents. Not yet, at least. Judging by the substantial buildings, I suspect the company hoped that the railway would bring development that would justify the station's existence. I mean, it didn't, but optimism is a wonderful thing. But enough of your foolish optimism, sir. I demand only facts. That's why I'm glad to once again be partnered with Ground News. Ground News is a news aggregator that not only shows you the news, but who's behind the news. It shows you the stories themselves, and who owns the news outlets covering them, and what biases you can expect. For example, take this story on the recent Spanish floods. I can see that the majority of sources covering this are left-wing, with 40% inclined that way, 30% right-wing, and 30% centre. And I can compare the different kinds of coverage. NRC Handelsblad, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, leans left and concentrates on the rescue efforts. The right-leaning Washington Times concentrates on the reactions of the victims of the disaster. But there are some stories that, let's be honest, certain people would rather you didn't hear at all, and that's where the blind spot feed comes in. This shows you the stories that one side or the other seem to be ignoring. Very interesting, and causes much thoughtful stroking of the chin. I also rather like the custom feed feature, which allows you to get news that relates to topics you want to see. So, if I want to know what's going on in London, say, I can just choose that, et voilà. Well, that's more Paris than London, but you know what I mean. If this sounds like a good idea to you, because it is a good idea, then I suggest that you follow the QR code or check out the link in the description, where for this November, Ground News is offering 50% off the Vantage subscription. That's the one I use, with all the fancy features. So, now you're in a position to get the facts about what's going on, let's return to the foolish optimism of the 19th century. Not long after opening, the line was jointly leased between the London and South Western Railway and the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway. The LSWR had the main line through Wimbledon, and the LBSC had the line through Croydon. In 1866, the LBSC would buy the line outright, and though they did offer the LSWR the option of going halves, the latter company declined. The line's main use was for freight. There was a lot of industry along the route, which is not exactly surprising, given that that was what the Surrey Iron Railway was originally built to serve. But passenger trains were not so popular. Equally unsurprising, given how few houses there actually were around here. 2 coaches were enough to cover the typical commuter pattern, and sometimes as little as 1. In 1910, the station was renamed to Morden Halt. Now, the definition of what constitutes a halt varied from railway to railway, but basically it meant a small, unstaffed station with minimal facilities, which described Morden to a T at this point. Despite the grand buildings, the station was no longer staffed. In 1923, the line was taken over by the Southern Railway, as part of a government-mandated grouping of Britain's railways. The Southern Railway's bread and butter was commuter trains, so you would think that this would mean that things were looking up for Morden Halt. Yes and no. Morden was about to undergo major growth, but this was definitely a case of be careful what you wish for the railway. Something was burrowing underneath that would change everything. The locals were about to go underground. The underground to Morden was rather controversial. Originally, the idea was that the district line would extend from Wimbledon to Sutton via Morden, and what's now the Northern line would extend from Clapham South to Morden and join the district line, again to Sutton. This provoked a dispute with the LBSC and later the Southern, who saw it as encroaching on their turf. Eventually, an agreement was reached. The Northern line would terminate at Morden, and the Southern Railway would build the line from Wimbledon to Sutton. The Southern's main fear was that the Underground would poach passengers from Sutton. But with this agreement, they were sacrificing passengers from elsewhere. One of the places affected was, obviously, Morden. Passengers preferred the faster, more frequent and more modern trains provided by the Underground over the wheezy Victorian trains of the Wimbledon and Croydon line. The Underground group also provided buses to feed into their lines, meaning that they could serve a wide area. Morden grew from a village to a suburb, but the old railway saw little benefit from this. One of the Southern Railway's priorities when they took over the railways in the south of England was to electrify their network. As the Underground proved, and had been proving for a long time, people just preferred electric trains. So it says something about how low priority the Wimbledon and Croydon line was that they just didn't bother. By the late 1920s, it was one of only 2 southern lines in the London suburban area that wasn't electrified, the other being the line from Woodside to Sanderstead. So in 1928, they decided to give it a shot and electrify the route. The trains were pairs of 2-coach units made out of obsolete LBSC carriages that had formerly been part of that company's first electric trains. These particular coaches were the unpowered ones, so the Southern stuck electrical equipment in them and put them to work. Because so many of the stations were unstaffed, the guard also acted as a conductor, selling tickets along the way. And so things continued. In 1948, the railways were nationalised. Following the damage done to the network by the Second World War, and with road traffic on the rise, the railways were looking to economise. In 1951, the all-seeing eye of British Railways turned to the Wimbledon and Croydon line for closure. Fortunately, it wasn't much of an option, at least for the time being. While passengers were few, freight was plentiful. In fact, there were so many freight trains that withdrawing passenger services wouldn't actually save British Railways that much money. That same year, Morden Halt was renamed Morden Road Halt. Now, normally when a station is called something road, that means it's nowhere near the place it's named after. But in this case, Morden Road is literally the road that the station is on. For once, I don't think the railway was pulling a fast one. But in the post-war years, many of the industries along the line began to move away. Those that remained preferred to send their goods by road. During the 1960s, freight declined drastically. In 1962, a study was carried out looking into whether the Wimbledon and Croydon line could be converted to light rail. BR decided that this was a nice idea, but not for them. Instead, in 1964, they removed the Sunday service at Morden Road Halt as an experiment. And the following year they did the same for the rest of the line. Then, in 1966, Morden Road had its Saturday service withdrawn as well. In 1969, British Rail renamed the station yet again, this time just to Morden Road. They had something of an aversion to the word halt at this time, possibly because they were trying to reduce staffing levels generally, and it was becoming a bit embarrassing to have to classify even quite large stations as halts. But that's just my theory. In 1971, BR announced once again that the line was to close, and this time there was a huge amount of opposition. Locals, including MP Sir Richard Thompson, argued that this would leave them with a very poor provision of public transport. Morden was fine, but places like Beddington Lane were badly served by buses. Roads around Croydon were congested, and the train was a far faster option, particularly in rush hour. In the face of this opposition, BR grumpily complied. But that didn't bring the passengers flocking to the line. In 1982, the long unused station buildings at Morden Road were finally demolished, and replaced with a basic shelter, more appropriate to a bus stop than a commuter line. In 1990, the service was reduced to one two-car train shuttling back and forth. But something radical was under consideration. In the 1980s, the government had become quite excited about the concept of light rail. The Tyne and Wear Metro had led the way in the UK, and it seemed like this was a good way to revitalise old lines. Light rail was cheaper to build and cheaper to run than conventional or heavy rail. The Docklands Light Railway was London's first venture into light rail, and it proved a great success. The authorities in Croydon looked at this and said, "Me too." You see, Croydon had a problem. In the spirit of post-war optimism, they'd thrown up a huge number of office buildings. But the roads were still congested and inadequate. The town had its rail connections, but they were limited. Some local places, like New Addington, had no rail link at all. The fear was that for lack of transport capacity, Croydon would asphyxiate. In the 70s, the proposal had been put forward to build a tram line to New Addington. With the now increasing interest in light rail, proposals like that one and the 1962 idea to convert the Wimbledon line had gained momentum. In 1990, Croydon Council surveyed locals about the idea of a new tramway, and the reaction was positive. But this meant the death of the Wimbledon to Croydon line in its then present form. In 1997, the last train ran through Morden Road. That which remained of the station was demolished. In 2000, Morden Road tram stop opened. Now it was a two-platform stop with a frequent service in both directions. It has a ramp entrance making it accessible. It even has out-of-station interchange with South Wimbledon Tube Station, meaning that for the first time the two lines can complement each other. In short, it's gone from an inconvenient and badly thought-out station in the middle of nowhere to a useful and convenient part of South London's rail network. And it only took them 140 years to figure it out. Well, I do hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I would like as ever to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the electrical equipment to my redundant trailer cars. I'd also like to thank Ground News for partnering with me on this video. Check out the link in the description below to take advantage of their generous offer. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.